Fears. Fears wrap around ideas, covering my senses. Breath between tears, my body shakes, rigid. I try to fight, pen in hand, no victory in sight, blank. Fears stop time, racing. Bathed in silence, screaming. Stillness rejoices in failure. I, trapped in my prison, built as my protection, remain afraid, quiet, blank. Welcome to the Memento Mori Lab podcast. I'm Myra, your host and aspiring creative friend. This topic has been brought up one way or another on every other episode I've ever done, and probably will ever do, because, let's face it, fear is everywhere. This is not that horror movie fear that we hide our face between our hands trying to hide, but also wanting to see just enough to know what happens. Neither is this the fear that lingers after watching thrillers, that makes me not wanna walk around the house in the dark or look in the bathroom mirror late at night. Anyone else? It's a more long-term, quiet fear, let's say. Screaming inside, but still quiet. I want to talk about the fears that we can blame for most of our creative struggles. I have many of them, and I'm sure most creatives experience them as well. Otherwise, the world would be overflowing with art. The worst part is, unlike the movies, we don't have just one monster to deal with, one villain. Nope, our fears come in packs. There's the fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of embarrassment, fear of not being good enough, scarcity, pain, disappointment, self-doubt, losing everything we don't even have, losing our minds, and even fear of success. I'm sure I missed another 20 items on that list. Imagine if each of us made our own fear-based lists. The result would be interesting, wouldn't it? I'm sure we would find a lot of common items among all lists, but still, it would be a long-ass list. It would be the longest podcast episode in history, which I googled, and the current record seems to be 36 hours. I think, though, the information is not as clear-cut as I expected it to be. One fear in particular that has always had a resounding power over me is my fear of rejection. There's something visceral about feeling that, quote-unquote, they didn't want to, right? We rarely think that maybe we just weren't a match. On job interviews, more often than not, the person just isn't a good fit for the company, even though they might be talented. Rationally, I know that, sure, but our fears are located in a different part of our brains, a part that couldn't care less about what's rational and logical. When it comes to my creative journey, my pattern has always been like this. Start doing something, it's fun for a second, and as soon as others begin to put some value on it, meaning pay attention, I feel potential rejection creeping in, and I want to quit. This is why it took me 32 years and counting to get more involved with my quote-unquote art. Now, I post my stuff on social media at memento.mori.lab on Instagram, for example, which you could argue has the potential to be rejected in some way, right? People might criticize it, they might hate it, they might not care at all. I think those possibilities don't affect me as much right now. One, because people have been really nice on Instagram, and, well, the majority of the people is not really paying any attention. So it's not like a imminent danger kind of thing. But it's not like Instagram will message me saying we didn't post that because we thought it sucked, you know? That would be terrifying. The truth is, as social beings, we all just want to be accepted, or whenever we create something, we are hoping to make some emotional connection. If we are rejected, it's more than not being good enough. It means you are out. You don't belong here. And every one of us is desperate to belong. Regardless of how quote-unquote weird we are, we just want to feel like a part of the world. Fear of rejection quickly turns into a fear of being abandoned, I guess. So many creative people end up curling back into their shells and hiding their creative side just to follow along with everyone else so they can fit in. This fear really holds us back. The thing about rejection that we can't seem to internalize is that most of the time the rejection is for our work, not our existence. We tend to feel so attached to our work that it feels like it's the same thing when it isn't. Whatever we create might have some bits and pieces of ourselves, but it is not us. We have a lot more creations within. It's not like every time we create something we lose a part of ourselves, you know? We are transforming things. The rejection is not a denial of our existence. It's just that that particular work didn't resonate with that person or with those groups of people, whatever. Given that we are artists and not mathematicians, another thing we dismiss about rejection is that it's an odds game. Maybe that's not an expression. Anyway, as an artist, probabilities aren't my thing, but the more I put myself out there, the more I increase my chances of getting a yes, right? If I call tails and flip the coin once, it's 50-50. If I flip the coin 100 times, I definitely have a better chance of getting it right. And maybe all we need is to get it right a few times. So what are your odds? If you're trying to get your illustration or article published, or your painting into an exhibition, and so on, what are your odds? The more we put our work out there, the more chances we get. And a part of me is like, yeah, but the more chances of getting rejected. And that's true. But the alternative to not take a chance at all is worse, right? Even with a pile of rejections, all we need is a couple of yeses to get off the ground. This podcast is called Memento Mori Lab. And Memento Mori is a reminder that we are going to die. Do we really think that in the end, any rejection will matter? Or will we just be surrounded by regrets of the chances we did not take, afraid of the rejection? This brings me to the other fear that I mentioned before, and I think it's one of the fears that haunt me the most, which is the fear of failure. It may be like a supercharged fear of rejection, right? While rejection is a bit more specific and it might be from one person, one group, one publication, and so on, failure is like you tried and you didn't succeed publicly because you weren't good enough. Failure didn't look so scary when we were toddlers. As we stumbled around like tiny drunk humans, we were always failing. Failure was just part of our days. We would fall over a couple of times, regain balance, and keep going. Speaking about stumbling, let's go to another poem. Stumble. I stumble on my lines, I stutter all my words, I steal my own ideas, I stare at all my time ticking. I forget what I meant to write, I filter what I was to say, I fight what I feel inside, I fear all I can't explain.
It's not a game, it's a rich thing.
Like the poem, we can't really explain these fears, right? I found it hard to put into words how afraid I am of these things that we didn't feel as a child. But we grow up and suddenly we know what it's like to be embarrassed. We know that feeling of blood rushing to our cheeks and everyone staring at us after we said something wrong in class. So we start putting ourselves out there less and less, because who in their right minds want to endure that kind of embarrassment? The fear of failure that began as a little seed comes out of a pipe, green pipe, and becomes a gigantic carnivorous plant that doesn't let us move forward. Any Mario fans out there? In our minds, failing is our death. But it isn't, most of the time. I mean, we rationally know that it isn't. To me, it feels like my fear of failure was a rope tied around my ankle, and as soon as I started walking away from it, it gently pulls me back a little, reminding me that I cannot go anywhere. Otherwise, I'll die. If we really think about the fear of failure, maybe there's no such thing. We are actually scared of being embarrassed. Ashamed. Embarrassment tells us we are not good enough, we aren't enough, we don't belong, we aren't lovable or loved. As extreme as that sounds, think about it. Whenever you feel like you're postponing something that you wanted to do, think about why. You'll probably say that you fear failure, but then keep asking yourself questions. Get to the bottom of it. Why is it really? What is it about the failure that scares you so much? For me, I feel like if I give it my all and fail, then it will be clear that I am not good enough and that I don't deserve to be loved and that I don't belong. I know, right? Everyone looks like they got their shit together until we go a bit deeper. That's why we keep avoiding the things we want to do or really committing to our creativity. We fear that trying our best will, quote-unquote, prove that inner monologue we had all along that we're not good enough was right. When the truth is, our self-worth has nothing to do with our creative output or any failure we might ever experience. Being loved or lovable has nothing to do with success or failure. We got everything mixed together in one bowl, but they don't go together. And the worst part about not learning how to be comfortable with failure is that we take so much longer to learn and to grow. Because the fastest way to learn is by failing and trying again. We change the strategy a little bit and try again and one more time. If we aren't willing to fail, how can we evolve? Maybe going back to the episode about control, what if we focus on what we can control instead of focusing on the outcome, the failure or success, the embarrassment or praise? I feel like I've missed so much for not being willing to fail, One way I'm finding helpful to deal with these fears is to write about them. Not this episode, but write to myself. So maybe write to yourself without overthinking, just stream of consciousness, what you were afraid of. And then keep asking yourself why. You can also ask yourself, so what? What if this happens? What if that happens? What happens then? What happens next? What if your fears come true? What then? Here is a good time to think about ways to prevent these fears from coming true, and then you can write about ways to repair the damage if they happen. This is something from Stoicism, and it's called Fear Setting by Tim Ferriss. I have linked his video in a previous episode, but I'll put it again in the show notes. If you are like me and you watch things but never do them, maybe just try the writing thing. Explore that fear and you might surprise yourself. One of these days, thinking about fears and all that, I felt like terrified and frozen by all my fears, and I wrote a poem about that. I think this is one of my favorite poems from this episode, and maybe in a while. So I hope you guys like it. Invisible monsters. I'm shaking, nervous, wired with nothing to fear. My stomach in knots too tight, killing butterflies. Why isn't the air reaching my lungs anymore? My chest is moving, diaphragm working, but no oxygen. I see no imminent threat in sight, but my throat is dry, my jaw clenched, my eyes stretched open in the dark. Invisible monsters hold back my steps, holding my hands. I was frozen long before winter, alive but weathered by potential failure, success, or any outcome in between. My body stone cold, ready to flight but never to fight. It's all an overprotection, an overcorrection taken too far. My mind ended up caged while monsters run free. And what if all these monsters were just part of me? I couldn't create an episode about fear and not talk about the fear of success. This was something that I never really thought about until recently. It never crossed my mind that we could actually be afraid of getting what we wanted. It's much easier to admit we fear failure or rejection, right? Maybe when we feel like we could reach success, the imposter syndrome kicks in, and all these voices go off in our minds, saying that we don't know shit and we cannot fool everyone forever. They say that soon everyone will see that you're a fraud and all that you've built will come crumbling down. We fear losing what we don't yet have. Perhaps a part of our brain thinks that it's better to avoid the pain altogether. Let's not bother doing anything now that we might lose later, because then all will have been for nothing. What if we actually got everything we wanted? What if we achieved success through our creative paths? It's kind of scary to think of these dreams as possible, maybe too scary, so we shut them down. We call them impossible, we focus on the potential failure, and we live our lives on the sidelines, watching the quote-unquote brave ones take the world by storm. What's hard for me to accept is that these fears I have are never going away. I keep pulling one way and the fears pull me another. It's this endless tug-war that fear wins every time. The harder I pull, the harder it holds me back. And I think that's where I've always gotten it wrong. These fears are here to stay, if not forever, then at least for a long time. Acknowledging their existence and accepting them as part of the journey is the best way to learn to live with them. They aren't going away, but they cannot take the lead. Here is where I'm at, or trying to get at. I can acknowledge my fears, and I know they think they are protecting me somehow. Our brain is always trying to make us survive, and it doesn't know the difference between a fear of a public presentation gone wrong and being eaten by a tiger. It's all so dangerous. In understanding that, I can be kinder to myself when these fears come up. And then, to paraphrase RuPaul, and yes, I love quoting him every chance I get, we can thank that feeling for trying to protect us and put it in the back seat while we keep driving. Point is, our fears cannot take the wheel. It's easier said than done, like most things in life that are worth our time. We might need to have a sequel because this episode is already way longer than intended. We still have to talk about self-doubt, self-sabotage, the stories we tell ourselves, and so much more stuff. Though most sequels aren't as good as the first one, sometimes they might surprise us. Which fear do you relate with the most? Hit me up on Instagram at memento.mori.lab and let's talk about these monsters. Look, maybe this episode helps you somehow, maybe it doesn't. But at the very least, I hope you feel less alone in the face of your fears. I'm right there with you, my friend. Oh, and by the way, happy holidays, everyone. I'm not much of a holiday person, but it's good to have some time off. Don't forget to share this episode, subscribe, follow me on Instagram, and all that stuff that people say at the end of these podcast episodes. Thanks for hanging around till the end. See ya. Wait, are you still there? Well, then here is one last short poem, just for you. Screaming fears. I search for silence in sentences. I find screaming fears I cannot face. The meaning of written words wears thin, next to my feelings faded in streaming tears.